So welcome everyone. My name is Denis Maksimov. I am a curator of exhibitions and public programming here in Pushkin House, and it's my utmost pleasure to introduce our first speaker of this season of 2024, especially after we launched the 3 new discursive strands of our public programming and exhibitions. And the talk today of the Professor Dan Hicks, who joining us today from Oxford University, where he is a professor of contemporary archaeology and as well the curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum. And his talk is framed within our discursive strand, which is called "What's in a Name?" with a question mark. And as many of you perfectly know, we live in the time when semantics of the words mean a lot more than the words mean and what the origin of the world is coming from. And this subject is very important for us in this season and in this year. And this subject is intrinsically connected and very, very much importantly intertwined with the subject of monumentality and the subject of statues, monuments, their fall, their rise, their laying down, their drowning, their putting back after they've been drowned. What we will talk also today about quite a bit. But then, returning to the core of the subject of today, Dan today will speak about specifically the subject of the fate of the monuments and the future of the monumentality. He's finishing the work on his book called "Every Monument Must Fall," which will fall in the end, which will come out. Yeah. Well, yes. Let's see. It was wishful thinking from my side. I revealed my ideology in here. But also, Dan is an author of a prize-winning book, which you can purchase downstairs, called The Brutish Museums. And as you all perfectly know as well, we are in a very interesting neighborhood. The museum, which is the maybe main hero of this book, is just stone throw away from us in here, and that also would be part of conversation today, the subjects of restitution, the subject of what to do with the objects that have very interesting and difficult provenance and difficult history, difficult words written about them, difficult labels written on them already, what to do with all of that too in that context. All of those subjects of heritage, naming, and again, the monuments and structures that meant to commemorate something, meant to statically inbuild and ingrain something in history. All those issues would be touched upon today during our conversation after the Dan's talk. But now I would like to give a floor to Dan, who will speak about the origins of brutishness.
Okay, wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction. It sounds like a lot to fit into half an hour or 40 minutes or so that I'm going to talk for, but for anything that we don't cover in terms of what we've heard that you want to talk about, we have an opportunity afterwards for the Q&A, and we are hoping it's an informal sort of setting, really, for looking at these issues, which I guess starts with your, program, What's in a Name? So I'm going to be talking about really different contexts from that which you're looking at in terms of this named building. But I work in another named institution in Oxford, the Pitt Rivers Museum. So it may be that those issues of naming and how we remember, how we make monuments to normally, dead white men often, how we think about them in the present and how they survive into the present. But in terms of names, I was also given a title for this talk, which I was very happy to take, which is the origins of the brutish, which of course was the pun at the heart of the title of the book that I wrote about the return of the Benin bronzes, and so that's not what I'm going to be talking about this evening. We can talk afterwards, we can talk about the politics of restitution. But I want really to try to expand some of those arguments that have been made and how much has shifted, you know, in the past 4 or 5 years. That is, of course, importantly in the context of much longer term arguments and campaigns and work to try to undo some of the structures that we see in arts and culture, you know, and indeed in institutions like this, institutions like universities, that have to do with making certain ideas from the past last, and so I guess often in terms of the context I'm talking about, making forms of ideas of being superior, of supremacy, sort of also last. So it may be, and let's say this as, you know, at the outset, it may be that the language of the 1980s and 1990s that we all know so well, that we're looking at some of these issues through a lens which we could call post-colonial, that language has failed. It may well be that we just open a newspaper or we doom scroll our social media at any point in the past 30 or 40 years or more and have to question whether we are in a post-colonial world, but also whether it's enough simply to say we're not in a post-colonial world, but maybe to ask about how is it that certain forms of ways of seeing the world, which include, in the instance that I'm going to give, the colonial in all its forms, how it is that certain locations in arts and culture and society, as well as those more obvious locations maybe, have been made to last. So what sort of artwork, what sort of form, what sort of entity would we say, a monument or a museum or an academic discipline like the ones I work in? I like to talk about how I work in the Tim Ingold way across the 4 A's, archaeology, anthropology, art and architecture, that rather neat sort of nexus of things that relate to the material and to the visual. How is it that those fields, since the late 19th century, maybe in a timeline that's quite surprisingly tight, that was a timeline of, say, half a century between, let's say, the 1870s and the 1920s. It's a timeline which is maybe, proto-fascist. It's a timeline that in the middle of it has got the Berlin Congress that sees a shift in forms of colonialism into new forms of sort of corporate colonialism, new forms of extraction, new forms of carcerality, new forms of racial capitalism, new forms of supremacy in all its forms, importantly using Fanon, forms that used not that mid-Victorian idea of racial supremacy, which he called vulgar racism, which was applied in the context of nature, that was a co-option of science to tell the fake sort of lies about there being different species of human, but that worked its way hand in hand with what he called vulgar racism, those forms of sort of cultural racism that used art and culture, that used that nexus of the monument and the museum and the university in order to tell stories with things that we value. So if we were having this conversation in North America, we might start with a land acknowledgement. But we're not having this conversation on stolen land. So maybe that's okay. But we know that in all its forms, whether the settler colonial, whether the extractivist colonial, whether the ultra-violent militarist colonial, or the corporate colonial, or the missionary colonial, or those other forms that we see empire actually taking. We know that if we know one thing about colonialism, we know that it never confined its activities to the land it stole. So the question for us in this kind of location has to be, what would a land acknowledgement in the context of a deterritorialized history of empire look like? What are we inheriting from those times? Not in a pure form of, oh, these are things that happened in the past and that survive almost like archaeological fragments, but were built in a way that make them incredibly hard to change. So that's the general theme. And I'm going to have to move this in the right direction. And the context, of course, as we've said, is the set of arguments that I put in the British Museums that relate really to, as I say, rethinking in that book, and I'm not going to rehearse the arguments of that book at all here, but to rethink the fact that there's a fault line in between the British and the brutish that we see, that I have to say, one experiences as one tries to walk to this building, and you have to get around the British Museum in order to get here. It's kind of in the way. It's certainly taking up space in quite an interesting way in our contemporary environment. What else is taking up space? One of the important contexts for talking about monuments, of course, has to be not just the monuments that were erected in North America, that of course were such a focus of the movement for Black lives as it emerged from, or re-emerged from 2014 onwards, in terms of the Confederate statues in the American South, not just Edward Colston, who we'll come to in a moment, not just Cecil Rhodes, the University of Oxford's enduring monument to the origins of apartheid, but also the monuments that were built sort of elsewhere in the world as well. And that includes South Africa, of course. And the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, as it emerged in 2015, is an incredible, continues to be, such a vital learning moment for all of us interested in these issues. Let's just rehearse those arguments, as they emerged, in South Africa in 2015. This was a point at the University of Cape Town where there were students that were 18 or 19 years old who were born after the end of apartheid, who continued to experience racism in all its forms at the heart of the academy and at the heart of the physical campus. There was an image of Rhodes, the diamond miner, the mass murderer, the inventor of the South Africa Company, interestingly the South African version of the Royal Niger Company that was at the heart of the history of the looting of the Benin Bronzes. But also, there he was as a symbol, as an art, in the form of an artwork, in the form of a physical human being rendered in materials. He was there as an endurance, not as a haunting or a ghost, but as a physical enduring presence. So at the heart of that campaign, what we learned, I think, what shocked some of us that work on in between the material and the visual in terms of the recent past, was an argument that an image is something that can hurt. An image is something that can keep an ideology going. So the removal of Rhodes was important in that context in Cape Town, because art and culture are things that are able to be put to work in order to make the past last. Oops. So I could just leave this running all night and we could just sit and watch it on loop, but let's just leave it for a little while. And let's think about the summer, let's think ourselves back to the summer of 2020. I did my PhD in Bristol in the late 90s, early 2000s, and at that time, it was my generation who failed to see the fall of Colston. It was a part of the narratives in the city, part of the dialogues. So many who were committed to that campaign sought to work through the institutional roots, through English heritage, as it was at the time, through the local council, through the stakeholders. There was a community feeling that this image of a 17th century slave, hopefully that's on still, yep. So an image of a 17th century slave trader that was erected in 1895, you know, and was there in the present, had no place in the city for the very similar reasons that we saw that were being argued in the Cape Town context. So the removal of Colston is important for us for two reasons. One is what happened legally after that, and the second is what happened institutionally from the museum after that. So in terms of the legal process, the so-called Colston Four, who went on trial in the months after the fall of Colston, were, you know, obviously acquitted. But important for that acquittal was the framing of the judge at the time. So the framing of the judge was to say that the role of the jury was to assess the relative weight of two different crimes. One was the allegation of the hate crime, that was the allowing of this image to continue. That was the argument that was being put, that simply to allow, for the city to allow this image to stand by the docks was itself a moment, you know, it was an act of violence. And you weigh that up on one side, you weigh that up on the other side against the damage to public property. So that acquittal was a very interesting moment for us to remind us, yet again, that surely of something that we all know, that art really matters, that culture really matters. When, I have to say, when we see the image of the Pitt Rivers, which we'll see in a moment, we should remember that in our museums, after we beat the fascists in 1945, one of the first things that happened in our science museums, in our museums of natural history, was that any last remnant of the displays of human skulls that had been so common continued to exist in some European museums on display. So any last remnants of that fake racial science in terms of the cultures of display were removed. And yet often nearby, in the case of the Pitt Rivers, right next door, I mean, we're the same building as the Natural History Museum in Oxford. Right next door, those of us who work not on nature but on culture, those of us who don't, I mean, we can call ourselves scientists when we want to, but those of us that are, more, arty, that work not on nature but on culture, we left those displays that were designed to tell precisely the same narrative over supremacy, but with culture, we left them untouched. So I think we need to have that as an important context for the failure to remove Edward Colston. But let's remember, that what then happened in Bristol, and I wrote a couple of pieces for Art Review that sort of make this argument at more length. One which was called Why Colston Had to Fall, and the other of which a year later was called Let's Keep Colston Falling, related to the action of the Bristol Museum and Art Gallery, which was to fish that old bastard out of the water and to put him back on display and to show him with the graffiti, to lie him on his back and yet to continue that regime of display, that visual regime, to centre Colston once again. So when we're thinking about the politics of naming, when we're thinking, I mean, really, this is a talk about memory culture. This is something that, you know, elsewhere in Europe is something that people talk about all the time, you know. But what is our Erinnerungskultur? What is the British? It often feels when you hear Conservative Party ex-MPs who say they have a right for the history of their family's involvement in transatlantic enslavement to be forgotten. It feels like we maybe have a culture of how to forget, you know, a forgetting culture, but maybe we don't have something as sophisticated as we see, and also as problematic, I have to say. I'm not saying the Germans have all the answers here at all, but, you know, what would a memory culture look like for the British Empire and for these forms of imperialism that we're talking about, these forms of endurances? And I hope all along, for those of you who don't work on empire, but work on other forms of memorialization and memory, that there'll be analogies that we can make that are maybe useful as well. Because this is about, you know, in this case, in forms of institutional racism, of course, fundamental to the Macpherson report, that, you know, from 1999, that was written in the wake of the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1994. At the heart of the Lawrence inquiry was the introduction into public discourse in this country of the notion of institutional racism. That the racism doesn't have to be individual people, you know, that are racist. It can be about structures. It can be about the processes that seek to you know, to preserve or to or can act in those sort of ways and to keep things going. What sort of memory culture, you know, is it that we have in this country that means that the first act of the curators was, you know, to resurrect the drowned Colston? So as I say, I work in a named museum, and here we maybe see some of the overlaps with the challenges for any institution which is named after anybody. But I want to show an image of the Pitt Rivers for a number of reasons. I don't know, and so for those of you that have never visited, I thought it would be helpful to see an image of what for many is, you know, a museum of museums. It's a place that obviously has changed. We know the work of the curator is often to put a lot of work in to keep things the same. And indeed, there have been times, you know, not least in my institution, but maybe in other institutions a stone's throw from here, where the role of the curator has experienced what we might call, and here I want to start to introduce some of the militaristic, you know, language, which is going to be important for where we get to at the end of this talk. There's a sort of mission creep, if I can call it that, whereby the curator thinks that their role is not simply to make, you know, to keep things the same, to stop the, you know, the moths from eating the fabrics, and to stop the, you know, the ironwork from sort of rusting away. Sorry? Precisely where I'm going. That is the work to the mission creep of the curator to the conservator, but thereby to seek to think that their role is also to not only to stop the change within the institution, but to stop history stop the world from changing around our institution as well. That's the mission creep that I'm talking about, which is, can we conserve the world? Can we shut up our doors? And in my next book, I have this wonderful account of, or I've been reading some wonderful accounts of sort of various points over the years in which the British Museum has felt, you know, under physical attack to the point at which they've actually had to put up barricades around it. The museum always wants to imagine, often finds itself imagining that it is, it's under attack somehow in those ways. So I want to say that, of course, it's important for us to hold on to the past and to hold on to things and to see value in these institutions and to keep the so-called number 9 cases there with the objects inside them. But what happens when those regimes of display start to fail? So any of you in the audience that have read the very boring, often sort of literature in STS, in science and technology studies, will know that one of the main things we learn from that field is something about failure. Something about, there's a famous article written in the 1980s called How the Refrigerator Got Its Hum, which is about failed technologies. Why do we not have gas fridges? Instead, we have electric fridges, which for all sorts of reasons are far less efficient and far worse for the environment. That's obviously a part of what STS teaches us, but equally, what STS shows us is that when things fail, we see them. You're on your way, to work, and your bicycle has a puncture. Suddenly the bicycle is visible to you in a way that on any other morning it isn't. Your car won't start. You see the car at that point. Something similar is happening to forms of this layer of art history, of culture. This sort of display, installed in 1884 at the University of Oxford, but sort of actually reproduced and copied from hundreds of other such institutions around the world, or around the Euro-American sphere. What do we call that form of display? What do we call that layer? We need to give it a name. In the 1980s, Hobsbawm and Ranger might have called it the invention of tradition, but the invention of tradition narrative was all about the creation of heritage for the purpose of the nation state. And it misses in many ways the dimensions in which, from the monuments in the streets to the objects on display in our museums, to the creation of the disciplines I mentioned at the beginning, history itself, but certainly archaeology and anthropology as fields, that aim to claim knowledge of the whole of the human past, the whole of cultural diversity of the world, to put on display objects in the Pitt Rivers and then other objects in the redisplayed Ashmolean Museum of 1884, which was also when the modern Ashmolean opened. So there were 2 museums of archaeology in Oxford that opened in the same year, one named after some 17th century guy and one named after some 19th century guy, who of course importantly was a soldier, as we'll get to in a moment. So what is that distinction? Why did the University of Oxford need 2 museums of archaeology? It needed so because it was making a distinction in between certain kinds of cultures, in between one museum of the West and one of the rest. And that's a fault line that is part of what we're preserving in these institutions. So I mentioned that Augustus Pitt Rivers was a soldier. It's worth mentioning, since we're talking about the Pitt Rivers, that the Pitt Rivers is unusual, but also maybe foundational for modern material culture studies, in that it is what's called a typological museum. So Augustus Pitt Rivers's theory of material culture began when he was, as a young man in the British Army, charged with the role of improving the British rifle. He was a drill sergeant and then a sergeant major. He went on to be a major general. He was at the heart of seeking to adopt the rifle to replace the old musket, a relatively small improvement in technology, which he argued from his experience in the Crimean War was fundamental, that sort of small change, fundamental to whether, empires fall or survive. So in the Crimean War, which we overlook, and was the main thing that we started talking about in terms of this, talk, we see what arguably is certainly an important part of the history of colonial war, certainly modern industrial war. This is obviously a war between empires, between, the French and the British and the Ottomans and the Russians. But what Augustus Pitt Rivers argued and sought to show, as we'll go back to in the diagram that we just saw, was that it was the fact that there were more rifles on the Allied side that led to victory. So what he did in order to expand that vision was he assembled objects that were washing up in London. This is a London history. He's based in London from the 1850s right up until the early 1880s when he moves to Wiltshire. This is 30 years, over which the foundation that's now the Pitt Rivers was on display, first in East London at the Bethnal Green Museum, what is now the V&A, or was until recently, they're now changing it, but the Museum of Childhood, for those of you that know it, in Bethnal Green. That's where they were first on display from 1874. They were then on display in South Kensington in what's now the V&A from 1878 to 1882. And, at their heart, the Pitt Rivers anthropological objects were at their heart a museum of weapons. The first thing that he collected as he came back battle-scarred from the Battle of the Alma, from his first-hand experience of the transformation of life into death at industrial scale, the transformation of landscapes into graves, the transformation of the living into the dead, from which, of course, he forges and has this key role in forging the disciplines of anthropology and archaeology as ways of seeing the world. That sort of militaristic context was part of it, but the theory he builds is, on the surface of it, a fairly sort of conventional Victorian improvement narrative, which he sums up in this diagram, which is it's a series of objects such as he acquired from the dealers and the soldiers returning from empire across London, which is it's an image of a series of objects, all from a single culture, from Aboriginal Australia, all of which he doesn't know how old they are. They're all wooden, objects which are weapons. You can see he arranges them in what he calls series, evolutionary series, if you like, although he doesn't exactly say that they evolve, but they improve over time. So you've got the boomerangs moving out to the left, you've got the lances at the bottom, you've got the shields. Importantly for the Victorian anthropologist, the shield was a weapon, which I think is interesting. And then at the top, the clubs as well. And in the middle, an imaginary wooden stick that represents the kind of original weapon, which we don't have in the Pitt Rivers collection, but everything else is there. So it is on the surface of it, that idea that objects are always improving. He's imposing, this is all fantasy. He doesn't know the relative date of these objects. He's just saying, we can, by form, we can tell stories about how people through use and fighting are constantly improving objects. This is what we build, this is what, in some ways, the Pitt Rivers is a monument to this idea. And at the heart of that idea, of course, importantly, is a militaristic theory of material culture. So we have in the Pitt Rivers not only objects that were taken with violence from empire, we have an intellectual dimension to that, which is about the idea that we can start to put objects as well as human cultures into some kind of evolutionary order, in order, of course, in this context, to talk about the improvement of the rifle. And of course, 1884 is not only the foundation of the Pitt Rivers Museum, it's not only the year of the Berlin Congress, it's the year of the invention of the Maxim, which was the machine gun, so important for the history that's in my book in the context of what's now Nigeria, but so important for the mass slaughter that we saw wrought by colonial officers over the course of the 19th century. So at the heart of that, and within the collections, and maybe the foundational object for all of this, is the rifle, is the musket that Augustus Pitt Rivers takes from the battlefield, at Alma in the Crimean War. So a part of it, those of you with interest in anthropological material culture studies, in some ways, this is where it all starts. What we learned from Rhodes Must Fall, Oxford, when in the autumn of 2015, Rhodes scholars who were paid for by the Rhodes Foundation in Oxford found themselves in a university that's exactly like the University of Cape Town, also has an image of the old bastard up, in this case, on the sort of public display on High Street, was an awareness that, well, if the museum was founded in terms of a theory of violence in this way, if the museum to some degree could be seen as a weapon, then so too surely can a monument. So too surely can, this sort of memory culture. And let's just look, this isn't often done for Cecil Rhodes, but let's look at the white Portland stone that's in front of us, and you see an image of a man in a business suit holding in his right hand the slouch hat of the imperial yeomanry. He might as well be holding a machine gun for all that tells us of this image of corporate, ultra-violent, militarist colonialism, such as what was wrought by his company, in his name. And this was erected in 1911, a little under 10 years after his death, and continues to stand. So if we could just run the video for this. These issues over memory and names and, the dead white men after whom our institutions are named is not by any means simply an issue for those of us in Oxford or London or Bristol, but also an issue around the world. And in this example, in Berkeley, California, where the name of Alfred Kroeber, the father of Ursula Le Guin, of course, famously, as a whole Ursula Le Guin conversation we can have about this at some point if you want to go that way. But Alfred Kroeber, who famously was an anthropologist, he kept an indigenous man whom he called Ishi as a museum exhibit in the museum. The building which serves as the University of California, Berkeley Museum of Anthropology was named after him as Kroeber Hall, and in 2021 it was unnamed. And the unpicking of that name, that image which we see on the right of the scrambled name of Alfred Kroeber, and on the left in New York, if you look in the right light when you visit the Metropolitan Museum, you can just make out where they removed the words. Can anyone read it? The Sackler wing, exactly. So, we can take these images away, these words away, but these traces, they're incredibly hard to get rid of. So you can unname something and somehow something remains. So what does it all add up to? I'm coming up to the end of my time. one way of thinking about this is about a history of visuality. And actually, I might end on this image, and we can start to wrap up. And so my colleague Nick Mazov at NYU wrote a really, for me when I was writing this book, but also as I've been thinking about the questions over monuments and, endurance of these different kinds has been very important for me. His book, The Appearance of Black Lives Matter, is so important because he talks about, someone that works as he calls himself a visual activist. He works in, media and sort of visual culture. What Nick argues is that a part of the way in which the enduring anti-racist civil rights campaigns that have happened in America, how they were transformed from 2014, and he takes as his sort of timeline from the racist murders of Eric Garner and Michael Brown in 2014 up to the inauguration of Trump in 2017. He talks about how it's a shift in our visual technologies, a shift in our regimes of visuality, and you can download this book online for free, which meant that the dashcam footage and the cell phone footage could make visible anti-black violence that had been going on for centuries. But it could suddenly be seen and shared, and out of that a certain sort of moment of politics emerges, a certain set of opportunities or affordances emerge. So Nick's argument, I think, is incredibly important for us, and it sort of leaves us with a moment of hope in some ways, I think, because what we see in the history of monuments, museums, and these academic disciplines that I'm talking about, which I'm saying were, and let's give it a name. Let's call it colonialist realism. Let's use Mark Fisher's account of capitalist realism, which famously, for those of you that don't know the book, he says the whole point about capitalism is you can't imagine the world otherwise. What is done with art and culture in this very tight, let's be good art historians here. Let's say there's really something going on here in a transatlantic context that relates to empire, relates to cultural supremacy, that has this 50-year timeline or so, this sort of proto-fascist history. How we deal with its legacies, it was inbuilt into culture to last. And when they pulled down Cecil Rhodes, one of the most important posters, or signs rather, that was held up at his fall read, "Now for the invisible statues." What are our invisible statues in this way? They certainly, these arguments have to take us into the library, into the museum, out in terms of the monuments, even down to who's named and who isn't, who's redacted from history and who gets mentioned. But the hope is, I guess, that you can use a tool for the wrong purpose, that you can take those regimes of visuality and do something different with them. And that's what Nick starts to point to, I think, in his book. So to sum up, we learn from, let's go back to that distinction between how surprisingly anti-racist the scientists were in 1945 in a way that those of us that work on culture weren't. And let's say that, today, we learn from those who work on nature. We learn from environmentalists. We learn in the context of, environmental emergency, that our main role is to learn how to be good ancestors. We have to learn how to leave a world behind us for those who come after us, which isn't full of, raised sea levels, overheated climate. We can widen that out to landmines from long forgotten wars that can still hurt. these sort of many ways in which the environment itself has a slow violence, but it's a violence that's enduring. What about those of us that work not on nature but on culture? What's our challenge? And I'd argue, and in my next book, there's the main argument of my next book, that our argument is exactly the other side of the coin. It's a related sort of challenge, but it's a bit different in that we have to learn how to inherit well. We have to absolutely think of our role in terms of being custodians or curators or even preservationists of the past. But that doesn't mean that we have to keep everything. I can't imagine any other sector other than the one in which I work where you could be told if something is wrong and hurtful that we've been doing it for years that you can't change it because that's the because what we need to save it, we need to keep it the same. How can we refuse to inherit some of what is in a place like the Pitt Rivers? How can we allow ourselves to inherit well in terms of what statues are in the streets, what stories we tell in our academic disciplines, but refuse others? How do we learn how to be a good descendant? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this very dense, I would say, very interesting horizon of thinking about what is actually an idea of dealing with the memory and how to sift through both the question of inheritance and the question of responsibility at the same time for that memory. And that's an interesting, actually, very interesting cleavage that all of the institutions around the world are living through. And there are a lot of issues I could get in, but I would love to give an opportunity to people in the audience to ask the questions. And online, yeah.
So we've got a question online from Alexandra. So first of all, she says, thank you, Dan. And what are your thoughts on the Museum of World Cultures of Dahlem now being called Museum of European Cultures after the Asian and African collections were moved to the Humboldt Forum?
Hopefully that's now on. Yeah, super. Okay, thanks so much for the question. So yeah, for those that don't know, that's a Berlin question. So that is about, some of you may or may not know about this thing called Humboldt Forum. I mean, we don't have time to, God help us, where, essentially the Prussian colonial Schloss has been rebuilt. And then they decided this was the right place to put the anthropology displays, which were formerly in the west of Berlin, in a place called Dahlem, as we've heard, where the museum continues to be. And so the question, so thank you, Alexandra, was that the name? Thank you, Alexandra, for the question. What do I think? I mean, so as we saw between the Ashmolean and the Pitt Rivers in the 1880s, there was a lot of, dividing up of institutional responsibility, even to the point where there was a shuffling of objects back and forward, in earnest, in order to create and to impose a division in between, the West and the rest in that way. When Heinrich Schliemann in the 1890s donated objects from his excavations at Troy to the University of Oxford, the authorities in the university decided that sort of Troy 1 to 4, which is essentially Neolithic, all those earliest phases would go to the Pitt Rivers, but all the shiny stuff, all the Bronze Age and so on, that should be in the Ashmolean. So even sites could be carved up in between these two, this distinction that was being made. What we're seeing in the German context, and indeed in other European institutions as well, is of course an attempt to sanitize, an attempt to reorganize sort of knowledge in certain ways. What's certainly welcome in that case is there is a public, campaign in terms of what to do with Humboldt Forum and how to think about it. There's a public debate, which I don't think we have in the UK in the same way, about art and culture in museums in terms of people really caring. And at the very least, it would be nice to see the kind of levels of funding that the Germans have for all of our institutions that relate to art and culture here. But no, the sort of white elephant, which is Humboldt Forum, and its effect and its awful effects upon, what sort of leadership we're seeing there for for other European nations and for the world, is in such contrast with the fact that the best of the museology that we're learning from is, from the continent of Africa, is from indigenous-led museums in, New Zealand, in the US, in North America. You couldn't get, there's such a sort of dissonance in between the doubling down on some sort of 19th century model versus the exciting, I've never felt more hopeful about museums and art and culture in these ways than this anti-colonial moment that we find ourselves in. And let's be very clear, this is like the movement from second wave to third wave feminism. The point at which it wasn't just that feminism could tell you about women's history, it could tell you about everything. It could tell us about English literature, it could tell us about healthcare, it could tell us about any part of our lives. A similar intellectual moment is happening for the anti-colonial, or what indigenous activists are calling the decolonial, and that is just happening, whether we like it or not, and it's our job really to learn from our colleagues who are leading this and are providing the leadership from the continent of Africa, from First Nations, from Native American and indigenous colleagues around the world. So I hope that's answered the question.
Please.
So how do you envisage a future museum that would address those ethical and historical issues? I know there's a project that every seed of the world has been planted, so in the future, if something happens, we still have these seeds. And I'm thinking, could we not do something similar historically and with our artifacts, but with a consensus of everybody? Is that discussion being carried out, or where does it stand?
So I think it is. Thank you so much for the question. I think, what does it mean to plant seeds for culture and art? And part of it starts, again, to return to the theme of trying to, use regimes of visuality for things that they weren't meant to do, but can start to, change them, undermine them in some ways. We need transparency. So a part of what I did in the British Museums was to take Nick's argument over seeing, and actually how that, simply the facts being out there, being able to lead into a politics, and to say the logic of, say someone's name, actually applies in the world of objects to make sure the objects are on the database and available in the public. The scandal that we saw at the British Museum, as I wrote, God help me, in the Telegraph last August. You have to try and reach the right audiences, right? But I did a big op-ed. Op-ed for the Telegraph on this. 5 million out of 8 million objects are not even on the database, and that's not for nothing, right? That's because if they are on the database, we can have the conversation about what we can understand what this institution is. So there are ways, and certainly for what I did in the British Museums for the first time, and that's been now superseded by wonderful work of the Benin, the Digital Benin Project, where they have been cataloguing where all the Benin bronzes are. We used to think that the items that were looted in 1897 were all in the British Museum, or all in the Met. Actually, only about 8% of them are in the British Museum. That's about 900 objects. Under 100 of those are on display. Most are in the store. And then there's the other 92%. Maybe up to 10,000 objects. We don't know how many still, which are in over 150 institutions around the world. So simply by making that list at the back of the book, which for me was the one sort of contribution I made, I made up some words which might be useful theoretically, and I wrote, there was a bit of theory, there was a bit of history, but actually one of the most useful things politically for museums, which was the question, was to say, here's where I think, and I was wrong about a couple of them, but here's my best guess at where all the, where are all the Benin bronzes. So surely transparency has to be. I mean, these are public institutions. We have at least to know what's in the bloody collection. I think that would be a good start.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Speaking of public institutions and transparency, where do palaces that belong to the royal family fit into this conversation? Because so many items are bound to exist in those spaces that reflect colonial extraction, and we have no access to them.
Yeah, okay, it's a really important question. You'll be happy to hear that the one thing that I have written on this was in The Guardian, not in The Telegraph. So you could look at the short piece I wrote for The Guardian sort of 2 years ago, which they gave you don't write your own headlines in life, do you? So it was like, why won't the Queen give back all her loot or something? I think they called it. But it's a good question. I mean, if you go to, Windsor Palace and look at the displays of, literally, war by war, that were undertaken under Victoria, you see how much war there was. I was reading The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi the other day, as you do, and I was because I just kind of wondered what did Polanyi, with his great account of the 19th century change, he opens his book, or in the early pages of his book. I admit I didn't read the whole thing, but early on in his book he talks about the 100-year peace between which he talks about as in between 1815 and 1914, and he says, well, there was the Crimean War, which was kind of a colonial war, so it doesn't really count. So even Polanyi, and I might give him 50 years, right? I mean, maybe there's a 50-year peace, but what we see, what is now coming into view, is the fact, and this is in the book what I call World War Zero, is the fact that from about, and you could argue the Crimean War is the foundational event because it ramps up industrial war production in those ways, but those weapons, those bullets, those rifles, those rocket launchers, those machine guns, the full weight of British sea power and army violence was enacted in punitive mission after what they called small war around the world. And these were significant enterprises. And Victoria oversaw that. And there's so much, again in the book, I only sort of touch on this, so much around the Diamond Jubilee in 1897, which is a big context for the Benin expedition, that actually Victoria at that point, so, she was sort of taking her, cocaine eye drops and was fairly, who knows how in touch she was with what was going on. In her name, that violence really under the Tory administration from 1897 to 1900 got just to another level. But absolutely, sovereignty was always a big part of what this it was about. Not only we know the arguments, importantly, we need to remember the arguments, underline the arguments over indigenous sovereignty, but also royal involvement. I mean, we can look back to, the involvement in the Crown, in the transatlantic slave trade, right from the beginning, the Royal Africa Company. We could look, of course, overseas at, look at the Belgians and the argument now, the important public debate over, the Belgian Congo, which was a royal enterprise under Leopold. But we have those questions to ask here. We need absolutely transparency about what's in the royal collections in the same way as we do about what's in our national collections. And what's interesting is all of I mean, we can talk about the Vatican Museum as well. The Pope has started to say he's open to giving things back and understanding what's in there. But how much work is there to do to understand what's in the Vatican museums as well? So this really is a moment at which we have turned away. We've hidden things away in the storerooms, and, you know, that goes for royalty, you know, it goes for the crown, it goes for our national institutions, it goes for the many regional museums. So many significant world culture collections in, you know, Bristol and Liverpool and Edinburgh, you know, Oxford and Cambridge, but also Birmingham, you know, and so forth. Most of our major cities have got significant world cultural collections. So, you know, this is now an urgent public need, in my view, because these are historical documents, they're important for cultures in the present, but they're also a part of our history as a nation. And therefore, absolutely, it should. Who knows, with the change of, you know, King Charles read Arcananthe at Cambridge, archaeology and anthropology, whether how that training, you know, now plays out, we will see. Yeah.
Sorry, would you add stately homes to that shopping list?
So the National Trust are very interesting in that, yeah, absolutely. But also, yeah, as you said, I mean, not only the National Trust, but also, you know, private collections. I mean, you know, this is. I mean, once you open the lid on this material, which is why, as I say, it's so important to see this as a moment of seeing, you know, and therefore we have to be incredible, you know, we need the Berger observation of, you know, this is about this is about ways of seeing as well. How do we see this material? How do we have these conversations? Well, you know, it's not right to, you know, reduce, you know, objects that were taken in violence, which are sovereign objects, which are objects of royalty. They're objects they're often religious objects of immense sort of cultural value. We can't reduce their meaning just to loot or just to a history of the British military, but we have to have the conversation, you know, from a UK perspective about those histories, so we can start then to talk about the attempts, you know, to destroy traditional religion, to make the claim to sovereignty, you know, whether in Nigeria or whether in, you know, Canada or Australia or anywhere in the world, you know, and also that attempt to reduce certain cultures to to having no culture. I mean, when the Benin bronzes were taken in this chaotic, you know, free-for-all where sort of 200 soldiers, sailors and administrators just took what they could for personal profit. You know, within weeks, there were objects on display from that event, you know, in the British Museum, in the Assyrian Saloon. They were displayed alongside the bronzes from this 500-year-old kingdom. Royal objects, sacred objects that didn't just represent ancestors, they constituted ancestors. They were taken from altars. They were displayed alongside objects from ancient Egypt and from the Bronze Age of the Middle East. And the message was very clear. We have blown you back to the Bronze Age. And absolutely, the Crown's involvement in that, and Victoria particularly with her interests in, you know, those forms of sovereignty, I think is a whole story we're only just beginning to uncover. But let's be very clear. We imagine the history of war as being maybe the Crimean War, then this big Queen Victoria-sized black hole, until we get, what, up to the Boer War maybe, and then, you know, 2 world wars and, you know, 1 World Cup, and we won them all, and that's our national narrative, you know. And like, that is where we're completely missing that, you know, that history. We don't teach it in our schools. I mean, this has been importantly argued for the history of the transatlantic slave trade. But even there, the story often is that we somehow won that as well, because abolition and emancipation was a great victory for the British. You know, it's for this much later. It's so recent, this history. It's so much later than 1838 or 1807. You know, we're talking the 1890s. We're talking the 1920s in some cases. We're talking about forms of violence that endure, and it's a difficult question to think about how much the colonial framing is important for contemporary world events, but certainly what we can say from the museums, from monuments, and from our universities is that we have been put to work to make those ideologies last, and we at the very least, we have to tell the story and to begin to unpick them and find better stories for the present, make our institutions fit for our times, and that includes the royal family.
Can I just add very quickly, I don't want to take up too much time.
please.
I'm not just talking about countries in the world that are part of the former empire and that contain people of colour. I'm talking about Ireland as well, which is our nearest neighbour. Yeah, but in terms of Britain's colonial history specifically, Ireland was our first overseas conquest. And I learned a few years ago that in the V&A, they have something like 90% of their Irish collections not on display. So there's like a whole subterranean world at the V&A of colonial acquisitions from Ireland that nobody talks about. And that should be part of this conversation. I guess what I wanted to know is how do we ask for those things? But we can pick that up privately,
well,
maybe by email.
In order to give you a very quick answer to that, we understand the history of these institutions. There was a V&A outpost in Dublin. They actually, in 1960, am I right in saying 1916? 1912 maybe it was, they put Benin bronzes on display. I mean, what on earth that message was for Ireland, that you're putting the loots from empire on display in Dublin, is interesting. But a big part of the history for the V&A was their role before 1920 in actually having a regime of display there. Augustus Pitt Rivers was posted to Ireland between 1862 and 1866, and he has his own. There's a whole Irish sort of layer to his history as well. But yeah, it has to be case by case. What I'm trying to argue for is a nuance in terms of how we think about empire and how it persists. It's easy to start. One of the risks for those who are detractors to any having this conversation in the first place would say, where will it end? What about this? And the whataboutism and the where will it endism is something we need very much to counter with a case-by-case, empirically accurate, detail that mines into the collections. But exactly as you say, if they're hidden away in the storerooms and they're not well or not accessible, it's very hard to tell those histories.
And actually adding up a little bit on the subject of the storage rooms and hidden, again, collections, I really liked the metaphor that you used in relation to comparing the hoarder attitude, basically, of the museums, sort of maniac hoarder attitude. It's sort of, if you'd compare a museum to obsessive person who just collects anything that is around and just not able to let it go, but just adds it into the attic and just tries to expand that attic to the extent that comparison would lead to, if again push that metaphor further, to diagnosing that person with a specific mental disorder, basically. And the question there comes how to Marie Kondo all of that situation, basically, how to sort of sort of very simple question and very complicated question at the same time. What the attitude could be in relation to heritage, and I'm actually not even talking only about the material heritage and material actually objects in the collection, but also to what you touched upon in the further points, to terminologies, to dead and empty words, to words that change the essential meaning in the end. So how can we sort of approach conceptually that hoarding and see it from another perspective that even might be useful to be seen by the people who manage those hoarded kurgans?
So I think the answer that's a really good question. I think we need to mix our metaphors as much as possible here, and we need to find as many analogies as we can because it will help us understand. And one, in some cases of things in the British Museum or in the Pitt Rivers or in other such institutions, we might not say are, the activity or the pathology of the hoarder, but the pathology of the serial killer who documents their crime through objects
hoarder and serial killer
that are kept. And in some cases, the men we're talking about, and they largely were men, really were literal serial killers. They killed a lot of people, right? And there are so I think we can, all of this. We must be very careful not to say, the British Museum, it's all stolen or it's all, this is, none of this conversation is an attack upon museums. I work in a museum, this is about trying to make our institutions fit for our times. In fact, the attack upon museums, upon monuments, upon culture and art, has a history. And we could call it not a culture war, but a war on culture. We could say that right from the start, in that early layer that I talked about, what was that? That was a use of culture. It was a co-option of culture, co-option of the idea of the museum, a co-option of the idea of the public statue, a co-option of the idea of the academic library or the academic discipline, in order to promote a narrative which is simply wrong and inappropriate for our time, that related to forms of supremacy. Therefore, our role has to be open to dismantle those, you know, on a case-by-case basis, while making these institutions fit for our times. We've never needed something like a World Culture Museum, something like, you know, decent public art. We can all think of examples of, you know, bad public art in recent years for very different reasons. But we need these conversations in order to, you know, make these things that we all care about so much fit for our time. So I think whether it's a named institution, you know, and how a name sticks and how you hang on to the name, you know, which is fine if it's, you know, if you want, you know, if it, as long as you accept that's an act in the present that you're doing, you know, or whether it's you're holding on to stolen art or you're hiding objects away because they might be there might be a difficult conversation to have about it, or you might have to give it back because you nicked it. You know, this is not where we have to be way past that, and we need, and I think what's, you know, there is in so many places we heard, you know, about the Humboldt Forum, let's leave that out of it. You know, let's hope for the next directorship of the British Museum. I have to confess I haven't put my own application in. But, you know, we have to hope that we know that in other parts of art and culture there is the right leadership that is helping us to, you know, to find the answers. And to resist the culture war, which has that war, you know, the war on culture is part of what has a history. It's part of what endures. When you get the Restore Trust attacking the National Trust, that is the same approach, the same playbook, you know, as we saw for the co-option of the museums in 1900. That's what they're trying to do for the National Trust, and it's why we all need to join the National Trust and help them fight these hard right attacks that they're seeing. But it isn't, you know, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It isn't like, there's a weird amnesia about these conversations. When you talk about restitution, you often have to go back to first principles and say, oh, you know, is it right to hold on to something that you took? Is it safe to send it back? No, we've had these conversations for 100 years. You know, the first objects were returned to the Kingdom of Benin and to the Oba of Benin in 1938 in a ceremony overseen by the British Museum. These are not new conversations. So we need to understand these histories, and part of that history is understanding the weaponization of culture by the extreme right.
Yes, hello. You said that colonial frame is really important for looking at the events of today. I would like to broaden the geographic scope and look at what's happening in Ukraine, where Russian troops loot Ukrainian museums. For example, the Museum of Anthropology in Kherson has been completely looted with thousands of pieces packed into lorries and driven away. Scythian gold disappeared. Monumental mosaics in Mariupol are being destroyed. And yet, you know, Russian museums, they are still viewed, major Russian museums, they are still viewed as these temples of culture on a par with Western museums, and very, you know, emulate in their practices and approaches, you know, Western practices. So the question is, you know, the way you portray the discourse, and I very much agree with this, that it's pretty much a dichotomy where we have Western cultural institutions versus post-colonial nations, Western institutions holding these huge collections, and now you have this complex discussion about decolonial practices, about decoloniality, about anti-colonial practices, and at the same time, on the other edge of Europe, we see practices which you describe very much like this militant, violent, you know, militarism, where cultural, you know, heritage is just being lifted and taken away. So my question is, when you see all these things, what in the West used to be past, in the east of Europe is actually present, and the picture seems no longer a dichotomy, it's a much more complex picture. Can you find the language to describe this complexity? You said the language is very, very important. How can we put into words the complexity that we are seeing? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. So yeah, it's really important, and I think we have to, you, I think, have got the answers far more than I have to the particular, issues over Ukraine, because I know less about it than the things that I have sort of written about. But I certainly think, there's obviously there's a set of issues there that relates to the enduring industrial military complex that has had a relationship to art and culture and museums, and to monuments in the streets built in order to march your troops up and down past. I mean, that's in large part of the this sort of nexus that we see. Now, if they start returning in the present, if there's an active, I don't know enough about the detail of the decision making there, in terms of whether the looting of the museums is it carting things off and putting them in a museum elsewhere? Is it active destruction? I don't know enough about that, but certainly if it's the former of those, if it is, if it's not just sheer, sheer destruction, but is the appropriation or an attempt to appropriate culture, then of course we're seeing the return of the playbook that was there, that the European, imperial powers, through corporate interests. I mean, so much of this is about sort of corporate capitalism. It's not really only the nation state that does this. So many of you don't, let's be very clear, you don't loot your own colonies historically. You don't loot a crown colony, you loot the protectorate, you loot in the conditions of informal empire, what they used to call gentlemanly capitalism. Looting as a tool of war, as a tactic of war, is something that comes very specifically in certain forms of imperialism. So maybe, I guess the best I can offer is that maybe if we understand kind of better what I see here about the weird notion, the weird mapping of the protectorate onto the idea that you're also going to say you protect the artifacts by taking them somewhere else. How much is that form of informal, corporate-led empire a part of what's in play in that context, as compared to just imperialism, colonialism, as a general word that we don't get any nuance to. So I think, the big thing that we learn from settler colonial studies is there are many different forms of colonialism, and they have histories. Maybe what we can do, if we see looting as a feature of some of them and not others, and indeed even looting, even the taking of cultural objects takes different forms, then very different. Obviously you could compare it to the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, or the destruction of the Iraq Museum, as sort of different sorts.
What is happening in India now with destruction of Islamic monuments as well, and
yeah, exactly. So I think maybe that certainly what I can tell you from the work I've done on this, this phase of World War Zero. This phase of industrial warfare in the long term and its relationship to art and culture is that it's a tactic of war, it's a tactic of certain forms of imperialism and not others. So they weren't looting Lagos as a crown colony, they were looting what later became Nigeria, and there are some further complexities about how that relates to settler colonialism, but for the continent of Africa, forms of extractivist colonialism were more in play at that time that the looting was happening, because it's ways to destroy certain forms of power and to put your own forms of power in. So taking art and culture seriously and realizing, presumably if it is a tactic of war, they know what they're doing in terms of how important museums and culture are. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe there are. I'm sure there are things written on this which those in the room know far better than me. But it is a reminder that if we're going to talk about the unfinished nature of this story, then we need to realise that it has a lot of different endings. That it isn't just one entity that carries on, and different things we could recognise. Part of the reason to write these histories is we can recognise when some aspects of them re-emerge in the present.
Hiya. I was just wondering what you think about how the way museums and I guess kind of displays that have been organised according to a colonial logic impact archaeology in the current day today and like present day archaeology. I was thinking about an example in ancient Egypt and how there's a real focus on, digging up another mummy all the time. And I just wondered how you think those two things interplay. So not just the way that we tell histories according to how they are in museums, but how those logics impact the way present day fieldwork and things are being carried out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. That's really important. So what is archaeology? Is it a discipline? In which case it makes us think, because of Foucault, just makes us think of sort of punishments, Is it a method, something kind of neutral? Maybe in the 1950s they were quite keen on that. Or is it, as I would say, is it a subject? And I think what I mean by saying that archaeology and anthropology are subjects is that they kind of start involving, you and me as subjects. They have been used, as we've been hearing this evening, for subjection, to subject, but also they are modes of subjectification. They subjectify us as the museum visitor. So, maybe 30 years ago, if we were having a conversation like this, we'd have been talking about, the Pitt Rivers or the British Museum as creating images of alterity, or these old words about kind of barbarism or, primitivism and all of those horrible words from the Victorian era, and our disciplines create those images, with these displays, this exoticism and Orientalism and so forth. Maybe today we do something else. We absolutely agree with that. But we'd also say, well, also if you visit the British Museum, you're being invited into some sort of international community who stand on the right side of the glass. You're part of a living community of civic museum goers, or indeed in the case of the BM, some international tourist economy, who are being subjectified. In some cases, you might say, certainly in the early days of the Pitt Rivers, you're being racialized as white, as being, and the men that were going around. We are sort of culturally white in this context. So what that means for archaeology in its practice means we have to look at how we, when you trowel back a surface, or you dig a hole, or you measure, survey a site, you're reenacting certain methods that were, via Pitt Rivers or whoever, learned from all, from a largely military background. Certainly they're passed down. The gestures, the bodily milieu, are passed down over the ages as well. So I think the ways in which those framings, whether it's, oh my God, why do people want to go and look at dead mummies and take their kids to see them? What is that? What is that? My colleague and friend Onikachi Wambu has sort of written about this a great deal as part of the work he's doing as the secretary to the all-party parliamentary group on restitution, which is led by Belrabir Adi, and he says, restitution isn't only about returning objects. It's about why would you want to go and gaze at the objects the dead humans in the first place. But that means in terms of field work, where we decide to dig, how we set up projects, who runs those projects, what does that look like? They're all forms of inheritance. So I guess the best answer I've got to you is to say, if we think about our discipline as a subject, and we think about how we're being, made to, because both feel, one of the best ways of describing archaeology and anthropology that I've ever sort of come across is to say it's an experiment you do with your body. You're told you need to go a long way away, or maybe not so far away these days. As an anthropologist, and might hang out somewhere, or as an archaeologist, you dig a hole, or maybe not even dig a hole these days, just sit in an archive or whatever you're doing. But you're taking your body to some stuff in order to make some knowledge. And we need to think about how how we inherit the gestures, which are intellectual gestures as well as sort of physical things, and shape the answer to your question, which I haven't done that well at sort of coming up with, as something to do with that thing I was talking about at the end, how we inherit well. Okay.
And maybe the last question, because we're a bit of running over time.
Oh no, we've sailed on, and that was very interesting, so it's fine. We can really talk it.
Any last questions? Because we just moved the conversation into the bar environment over drinks after that.
I think there's one last question online that's really
please,
interesting.
Please.
And so it's about restitution, which you've kind of touched upon a little bit. Does restitution include not just, I think the point of the question is like not just repaying what has been taken or what has been looted or what has been destroyed, but does it include any sort of pecuniary punishments, on top of it to make that rhetorical point? And they've specifically obviously brought up the case of Ukraine, Russia right now, because it's an imperial power acting with the knowledge of, what you've talked about today. That
Super. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm trying to summarize the question. I'm sorry if I did it very badly.
Okay, thank you. Who is it from? Do we have a name? Or just a handle?
They wanted to remain anonymous.
They wanted to, okay.
Yeah.
Hello, Anonymous. Thank you for your anonymous question. We've already covered punishment a minute ago when we were talking about Foucault. So let's not go, this isn't about, nothing that we've been talking about today has been about trying to punish anybody for anything. But that also doesn't mean that we can't talk about endurances from the past and endurance, inequalities, not least, of course, as we learn from the conversations over the history of enslavement and emancipation, that this country only got to the point of having repaid the debt for the 20 million quid that they gave to the slave owners in 2007, by some accounts. So these things last. The debt lasts in all sorts of ways. When I mentioned the Belrabiro Adi-led all-party parliamentary group, that is for, and so Onikachi is the secretary for the restitution side. The full scope of the group is for African restitution and reparation. And I think to put together those two very different questions as part of an Onikachi, you should have him in to speak. He has this incredible, he has his 7 R's, although they keep going, I think there's 9 R's now, but they're remembrance, restitution, reparation, repair. I mean, anyway, it's wonderful. But what absolutely reparation is, of course, it's a different discourse, but it is a discourse that is one that we can learn from in restitution, and also the restitution debate can inform the reparation debate. And I think what we're certainly, as we seek to develop something like a memory culture in this, in this country, we can't just do what I began with. Let's just end by talking about the beginning. We can't just do a land acknowledgement, which importantly in North America is being criticized as well. You're acknowledging that you took all this stuff, and then, now we're going to have the conversation. Yeah, like, we're not going to give anything back. Of course, it has to be, this work is absolutely, pointless if it doesn't have some degree of, change, some degree of, well, we're going to do things differently. So in the book, I talk about the difference, but I talk about a theory of taking. In anthropology, we have theories of gift exchange, that when I give you a gift, you then kind of owe me, and that's an obligation, reciprocity and obligation. We don't ever talk about a theory of taking. Well, I take something from you, I definitely owe you something. And maybe that's a different sort of obligation and a different sort of debt. So yeah, we need what I hope we're going to get, I think we are getting increasingly in this country, is a, is an increasingly sophisticated conversation about reparation that talks about, all of those issues, and really talks about fundamentally, what was, if we're not standing here on stolen land, that doesn't mean there isn't resource, in this landscape that we're in the Bloomsbury area of London, much of which is owned by Lord someone, or whatever it is, by sort of landed interests of all kinds, which have links to these histories. We need that.
And
that
property, I think, has links to this history of hoarding, maybe, sort of in a sense that if you are continuing to own and the hoarding objects are continuing to be present in the same precise way, but it's sort of a conversation that could go in very many.
But ultimately, the logic has to be that if you take something and you're found out, then you give it back. And someone my childhood priest will be in my high church Anglican upbringing would be very upset that I can't remember which commandment it is, but the Pope, when he was talking about returning the stolen objects in the Vatican, referred to whichever, is it 7? Whichever commandment it is, thou shalt not not steal. So if you take something, you give it back, I think obviously surely operates in some manner for reparation as well as restitution. But the challenge is, how do we do this? We're working out how to do restitution in the museums world. We're working out how to take down statues on a case-by-case basis when that's what a community or an institution wants. Surely we can have the same level of a grown-up conversation, whether it's about the change of a name of a building, as you're doing here, or whether it's about the repayment of a historic debt, which is overdue.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thoughts and conversations which you are welcome to continue at the bar.